Well, I appreciate the opportunity to share a couple of things about St. Joseph in this year of St. Joseph. Our diocese declared a year of St. Joseph, and then the Holy Father validated that by declaring a year of St. Joseph. And quite frankly, I just don't think we can celebrate his life enough and learn from his example enough. And when you look at St. Joseph, one of the things that's interesting, we often say everything in the Old Testament is fulfilled in the New. And if you look at the figure of Joseph in the Old Testament, and you can see the parallel with Joseph in the New Testament. Both sons of Jacob. Jacob in the Old Testament is going to become Israel. And we know that Joseph is basically sold into slavery by his brothers and ends up going into Egypt, which is this horrible story of a terribly dysfunctional family and the bitterness and jealousy of that. But how God uses that when a great famine hits the chosen people, that they go to Egypt, and it is Joseph who's able to basically rescue Israel and feed them. And so it's an amazing story, really, of Joseph not harboring any grudge, but when that great line, "I am Joseph, your brother," when in that moment of revelation, and it's a moment of revelation of compassion. And in the gospel story, do we not have a new Joseph who, like the one who saved the chosen people, kind of became a new Joseph for us in the line of David, who takes care of the Christ child, who is the chaste spouse of Mary, and becomes our patron, looking out for the children of the new covenant. And it's a beautiful thing how he also takes the Christ child and Mary to Egypt, and then from there we see that parallel, that everything in the old is fulfilled in the new. And so we can see how God uses Joseph through these stories, and both in the old and the new, where there's an inspiration. Joseph in the Old Testament is a dreamer, and in the New Testament, the way that the Lord speaks a lot of times is in a dream to Joseph. And so it's through this divine inspiration that inspires his intervention that leads to our salvation, the salvation and safety of the Christ child. And so I guess it took me a while to appreciate that. I grew up with a pastor, David Joseph Schiller, who was born on Christmas Day, and he had a great devotion to St. Joseph. And one of the holy cards that I keep in my breviary is his holy card. And it's a statue, a very sweet little print of St. Joseph carving a toy for the Christ child. Now, we often think of Joseph as a carpenter. I think the word in Greek is that he's like a craftsman. So we know that if he was working with wood or if he was working with stone, as we believe in Nazareth, he would have had some bulk to him, would have had strength, and of course he would have been, a skilled craftsman. And of course he taught the Christ child this as he was growing up in his hidden life. And so there are a lot of things that we'd like to know about Joseph. He doesn't speak in the gospel. I've mentioned that to you in our mailing that we did with the prayer book to all of our parishioners, and in the comments about St. Joseph. But today, just to think of him as this intercessor who acts. He doesn't need to speak, his actions speak with this integrity that he has, that he's open to the inspiration of God, and then he acts and intervenes. And we need that right now. And a couple of stories that I have. One of the stories of St. Joseph's intercession, this intervention, happened in my own life. In my first parish up in Swannanoa, I was at St. Margaret Mary, and as things were coming together, and the parish was really starting to grow, and numbers were up, and we were doing very well. And about that time, a famous blanket company up there laid off a lot of employees. Right in the beginning of November, it really hit the people. And so here we were in this situation where a lot of folks in our little community of Swannanoa were being laid off, with Owen and with Beacon Blanket ceasing some of their production. And around that time, since I was still a relatively new pastor, I went to visit this cooperative ministry to feed the poor of the Swannanoa Valley. And I went there, and they were talking about how this economic impact was adversely affecting the people right at holiday time. And their goal was to try to feed all the requests that they were getting for Thanksgiving meals, that everyone would be able to have a turkey feast. And it was a small budget, a small operation. And just I have to tell you, at the time, it was as if, like a word came to me like, Anthony, it's time for you guys to step up to the plate. And, it was a small parish with limited resources. But at the time, I asked them, in the Montreat Black Mountain area, the big church is the Presbyterian church. And I said to them, how many turkeys do you need? And so they told me, and said, how are you going to get them all? I said, well, through the parishes or the different churches. And I said, well, who's your largest contributor? And of course it was the Presbyterian church, whose pastor I knew. And I said, well, I tell you what, we at Little St. Margaret Mary's, we're going to do that. We're going to give you that and then some, because I don't want you to think that the Catholic Church is going to be outdone in charity in this moment. And, with kind of like bravado, I thought that would be kind of cool. And I said, and if he wants to go and increase his to beat us, great, more power to him. And I kind of got back to the rectory after that visit, and I was moved to, like I said, to contribute. But then kind of like the reality, small parish, no staff, I'm there, and I'm thinking like, Anthony, what did you do? What did you do? How are you going to, honor that commitment, which was like most of a week's collection? And we were a little tithing parish at the time, but I was like, I'm gonna have to call my brothers up and see if they can't, cover my check, and so it happened that the weekend was there. And once again, now, in the fall, a lot of people come up to the area to look at the leaves and things, but this was post the post-October leaf peepers. And I was at Mass, and being the only, it was a little parish, so you gave out communion, you pretty much knew who was at Mass. And even in the back area, the extended area, you would see most people who would come to the Mass and certainly come to communion. But what happened was, after Mass, this man came up, and he was very, very nicely dressed, got white hair, kind of combed back, rather dapper guy. And I thought maybe he was, either there for the leaves, or which had really kind of ceased. So I thought maybe he was a golfer, and I thought maybe a Floridian that had come up. Well, anyway, there I am. And he says, Father, here's something for the poor. Here's something for your poor. And he gave me an envelope. And in this envelope, which I just took, I didn't even really look at it, and I stuck it into, if you could imagine this, at the time we had a little Scottish lady who would take the collection and count it in a brown paper bag. Not exactly the most secure things, but anyway. Well, she told me, Father Anthony, she said, she says, you might want to look at this. Plain white envelope. And let's say that the check that I had written for the food pantry was $2,800. In this white envelope, there were $2,800 bills, in exactly the amount that we needed. And I was like, that's uncanny. First of all, who has like a white envelope? Who has that much cash? And so one day we were driving up in the mountains, and I told Bishop Curlin that. I said, the whole thing that I just said, and we were driving, we were going by St. Margaret Mary's on the way to a confirmation. And I said, I never knew who that guy was. Never saw him again. He never said his name. It was at the end of Mass, kind of like in the busyness. But when I saw him, he was like, just kind of struck me, kind of handsome, dapper, and just very discreet, and took it, boom. And, I said, I didn't know if he was a golfer. Then it was cash. And I thought, is that restitution money? Whatever. So I'm driving, and Bishop Curlin looks at me and he says, I know exactly who that was. And I was like, you do? He says, yes. He says, that was St. Joseph. But he said it with such a seriousness that I was like, really? He said, yes. He says, it's happened to me before. And then he told the story of when he was in, it was St. Mary's, which was in a marginalized part of Washington at the time. In one of his parishioners, a poor African-American lady, her husband had died. And so he kept asking her when the funeral was going to be. And she said, oh, Father Curlin, I can't have the funeral. They won't release his body till I can pay for the service. And he, that hit him very hard. He said, oh my God, this woman has had this open-ended grief because she can't afford the funeral, doesn't have a line of credit to pay for it. And so he said, well, how much is the funeral? And so he talked to the funeral director, and he wrote the check for $800 so that this funeral could happen. And kind of much in my situation doesn't sound like a lot of money now, but back then it was a lot of money, especially if you didn't have any in your parish. He thought, oh my God, well, that bill's going to come due. What am I going to do? So he said, I think maybe I'll have to ask my stepfather to pay for it. Well, he says one day, that night, a man, he said, in a blue long coat, white hair, a blue long coat, knocked on his door. He said people would often do that, because of where he was. And a lot of times they were asking for something, but sometimes they would knock on the door because they heard of his work. And he said the man gave him an envelope. And he said basically the same kind of thing. Here's something for your poor father. And so Bishop Curlin said that he took it and he put it into his suit pocket, in the breast pocket of his coat. And he says, later that night, Anthony, he says, I was changing, and I took my coat off, and I realized that the man had given me an envelope. So he said, I opened the envelope, and in the envelope was like the $825 that he needed to pay for the funeral. It's like the exact amount. It's just one of those things that kind of makes you quiet. Like for my story, I was like, the Catholics will not be outdone in their generosity. St. Margaret Mary will not be outdone in its generosity. And what I learned was St. Joseph would not be outdone in his generosity. And so I've seen this happen many a time in with certain people. One of the ladies just asked me to tell the story of when I was in the seminary. I was, if you can imagine this, we would spend the night at a shelter that was run in a Lutheran church. And one of the religious sisters, a Catholic religious sister, had gotten the space from this church that was being underutilized. And most of the residents, it was a woman's shelter, most of the residents had been, quite frankly, abused. They were in dysfunctional relationships. It was a disaster. Their lives were just disasters. And so she could have a night off. We would go, two of us would go from the seminary, a buddy of mine, we would go from the seminary, and the idea was that we would be with her and we would cook the meal, clean up afterwards, and then what she really wanted was just some interaction with the residents. And so we would play board games, we would play Go Fish, we would play cards with them, and then just to have some positive interaction. And then they would all, of course, they had their dormitory that they would all go to. And we were, because of the neighborhood, charged with, I don't want to say guarding, but watching the property. And then even were two cots for us to, if we needed to take a nap, right? Now, you can imagine, I'm kind of wired. I'm like, I can't sleep in here and everything. So, I start exploring. I'd look at everything. And this sister, very good sister, was, if you will, a thoroughly modern sister, okay? And a very kind of active, peace and justice sister. But what struck me was I'm looking around in the office in this one little area that we were in. She had a statue. And when I say a statue, I mean a very pious statue of St. Joseph, which didn't kind of fit with like a lot of the other stuff in her life, like just the way she dressed or her art and other things. But there was this really pious statue of St. Joseph. And you know me, if you don't know me, I'm a curious guy. And so under the statue, I could see this piece of paper. And so inquiring minds want to know. So I kind of moved the statue up and looked, and there were these pieces of paper. And these pieces of paper had intentions on them written in this nun's hand. I recognized her hand, but they kind of surprised me, because they would be for things like, that Elizabeth could find a job, or, help us, get hearing aids for somebody. I mean, very specific things. And it was, very touching in a way too, but also kind of like, really, little intercessions under the statue of St. Joseph. So I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. Another week there, and look, different intercessions. And I go and see the statue, and there's more paper, more intercessions, very specific kinds of things. And so finally, I said, I got to talk to her about this, because it didn't seem to jive with like the rest of her spirituality and her piety, that she would have this piety with St. Joseph, putting pieces of paper under his statue. So I asked her, I said, hey, kind of curious, I find these intercessions underneath the statue of St. Joseph. It looks like you wrote these things. She said, oh, yes. And she said it with such a surety of faith when she spoke to me. She said that God had put St. Joseph in charge of the Holy Family, with Mary, who would have been one of the most vulnerable women at the time, if you think of it. And she said, and so I know that He will take care of these women who are most vulnerable because of their situation in their lives. And I was like, well, made a believer out of me. I get choked up thinking about it. But things like that, where He is a father, God's a father to the poor, but Joseph is the shadow of that paternal care. I love that image that Pope Francis talks about, that that we all need kind of a shade. And you think about that rest that comes to them on the flight into Egypt, and that through His paternal care of the Holy Family, under this umbrella of His protection, and anything good that you can say about that paternal care is Joseph. And so some people say, gosh, I wish we had more of them in the gospel, that He had said more. I said, no, His actions speak. His actions speak. And what I'm here to tell you is that they speak now. They speak now. He is a very powerful intercessor, especially to the poor, to the vulnerable. And through the intercession of Joseph and Mary. A lot of times we go to Mary, but I say, go to Joseph. And in fact, that's a line right out of the Old Testament, to go to Joseph, that we can go to Joseph, with that paternal care. If we discern, as he did, God's will in the dreams, that He will provide, that our provident God will provide. And what a beautiful example we have of that, of Joseph, who in every age, and finally declared by the church, has done just that for us as brothers and sisters, for us as members of this household of God, who have, through the foster father of Christ, through the most chaste spouse of Mary, an example and guide. So I have lots of things I'd like to say about Joseph, but hope you enjoy those stories. Ask Him in your need, and rely on God to give you the daily bread that will sustain you from here to heaven. God bless you.